What if I told you that some of the most powerful men in history died asking about soup? Or that two presidents died on the exact same day thinking about each other in their final moments? Today we're diving into the last words of America's presidents, and trust me, these stories will blow your mind. Death doesn't care if you're the leader of the free world. When your time comes, you're just another human being facing the great unknown. But here's what's fascinating: the final words these men spoke reveal more about who they really were than any speech they ever gave from the Oval Office. We're going to explore the deaths of past U.S. presidents, and I guarantee you'll never look at these historical figures the same way again. Some died with profound wisdom on their lips, others made jokes, a few talked about their wives, and one president's last words were so ordinary, they're almost funny. Let's start with one of the most incredible coincidences in American history. July 4th, 1826, exactly 50 years after the Declaration of Independence was signed, two of its most famous authors were dying on the same day, hundreds of miles apart, and neither knew about the other. Thomas Jefferson was lying in his bed at Monticello, barely conscious. He'd been sick for weeks, but somehow he'd held on. As morning broke on July 4th, he opened his eyes and whispered to his doctor, "Is it the 4th?" When they told him yes, Jefferson smiled and closed his eyes. He died that afternoon. But here's the crazy part. Up in Massachusetts, John Adams was also dying. The 90-year-old former president had been bedridden for days. His last words? "Thomas Jefferson survives." He had no idea that his old friend and political rival had died just hours earlier. Adams passed away that evening. Think about this for a second. Two men who helped create America, who had been friends, then enemies, then friends again, died on the same day thinking about each other. If that doesn't give you chills, I don't know what will. The third founding father president, James Monroe, died 5 years later. His final words were heartbreaking. "I regret that I should leave this world without again beholding him." He was talking about James Madison, who had died just weeks before. These men who built America together couldn't bear to leave each other behind. Now let's talk about the presidents who died suddenly, without warning. Abraham Lincoln never got to say goodbye. He was watching a play at Ford's Theater with his wife Mary when John Wilkes Booth crept into their box. Mary was worried about what people might think of her holding Lincoln's hand in public. Lincoln's last words were, "She won't think anything about it." Seconds later, Booth pulled the trigger. Lincoln never spoke again. The man who saved the Union died because he wanted to hold his wife's hand at a comedy show. Sometimes history turns on the smallest moments. James A. Garfield's death was even more tragic. He was shot by an assassin at a train station in 1881, but the bullet didn't kill him right away. For 2.5 months, he lay dying slowly while doctors tried everything they could think of. They didn't understand infection back then, and their dirty hands and instruments made everything worse. Garfield knew he was dying. His last words were spoken to his friend and secretary, "My work is done." But here's what's really sad. If he'd been shot just 20 years later, when medicine had improved, he probably would have survived. The bullet wound wasn't that serious. It was the medical care that killed him. William McKinley faced a similar fate in 1901. He was shaking hands at the World's Fair in Buffalo when Leon Czolgosz shot him twice in the stomach. As McKinley was falling, he saw the crowd moving toward his attacker and said, "Don't let them hurt him." Even while dying, he was trying to prevent violence. McKinley lived for 8 days after the shooting. His final words were part of a hymn he was singing, "Nearer, my God, to thee, nearer to thee." He died believing he was going to a better place. John F. Kennedy's death is probably the most famous presidential assassination in history. He was riding in a motorcade through Dallas with his wife Jackie when Lee Harvey Oswald opened fire. Kennedy's last words were spoken to Nellie Connolly, the Texas governor's wife, who had just said how much the Dallas crowds loved him. Kennedy replied, "No, you certainly can't," referring to something about the weather or the crowds. Historians still aren't completely sure. Those were the last words of a president who had inspired a generation to ask what they could do for their country. A few seconds later, the shots rang out, and Camelot was over. Warren G. Harding died under mysterious circumstances in 1923. He was on a speaking tour when he got sick in San Francisco. The official cause was a heart attack, but some people suspected poisoning. His last words were spoken to his wife Florence, who was reading him a newspaper article praising his presidency. "That's good. Go on. Read some more." He died in his sleep that night. Franklin D. Roosevelt died suddenly while posing for a portrait in Warm Springs, Georgia. He'd been complaining of headaches all morning, but nobody thought it was serious. Then he put his hand to his head and said, "I have a terrific headache." Those were his last words. He collapsed and died of a massive stroke a few hours later. Roosevelt had led America through the Great Depression and most of World War II. He'd been president longer than anyone else in history. But in the end, he died like any other person, with a headache that turned out to be much more serious than anyone realized. Some presidential last words reveal just how ordinary these extraordinary men could be. Millard Fillmore, the 13th president, died in 1874 after suffering a stroke. His doctor was trying to feed him some soup, and Fillmore's last words were, "The nourishment is palatable." He was basically saying the soup tasted okay. Imagine having that on your tombstone. James K. Polk died just 3 months after leaving office. He'd worked himself to death during his presidency, keeping a promise to serve only one term. His last words were spoken to his wife, Sarah. "I love you, Sarah. For all eternity, I love you." After all the political battles and hard decisions, love was what mattered most to him in the end. Zachary Taylor died after eating too much milk and cherries at a July 4th celebration in 1850. He got violently sick and died 5 days later. His last words were, "I should not be surprised if this were to terminate in my death. I did not expect to encounter what has beset me since my elevation to the presidency." He knew the job had killed him. Benjamin Harrison died of pneumonia in 1901. His last words were, "Are the doctors here?" He was asking if his physicians had arrived, but they came too late to save him. Sometimes the simplest questions become the most profound when they're your last. Andrew Johnson, who became president after Lincoln's assassination, died of a stroke in 1875. His last words were, "I need no doctor. I can overcome my own troubles." Johnson had always been a fighter. He was the only senator from a Confederate state who stayed loyal to the Union. Even on his deathbed, he was trying to fight his way through. Ulysses S. Grant knew he was dying of throat cancer, probably caused by his cigar smoking. He spent his last months racing to finish his memoirs so his family would have money after he died. His last words were, "Water." The general who had won the Civil War died asking for a simple drink of water. Rutherford B. Hayes died of a heart attack in 1893. His last words were, "I know that I'm going where Lucy is." Lucy was his wife, who had died 4 years earlier. She'd been called Lemonade Lucy because she banned alcohol from the White House. Hayes had loved her deeply and couldn't wait to see her again. Theodore Roosevelt died in his sleep in 1919. His last words were spoken to his wife Edith. "Please put out that light." He was asking her to turn off the lamp so he could sleep. The man who had been shot during a campaign speech and kept talking for 90 minutes died asking for the lights to be turned off. Calvin Coolidge died of a heart attack in 1933. His wife Grace found him collapsed in their bedroom. His last words were spoken to his barber earlier that day. "Good morning, Robert." Even Silent Cal, known for barely talking, was polite to the end. Herbert Hoover lived longer than any other president. He made it to age 90. His last words were, "I'm fed up with it." He was talking about his illness, but given how much criticism he'd faced over the Great Depression, maybe he was fed up with more than just being sick. Harry S. Truman died in 1972 at age 88. His last words were, "I'm going to sleep now." The man who had made the decision to drop atomic bombs on Japan, who had fired General MacArthur, who had desegregated the military, he went out peacefully, ready for rest. Dwight D. Eisenhower spent his last years fighting heart disease. The 5-star general who had planned D-Day was tired of fighting. His last words were, "I want to go. God take me." After a lifetime of leading others into battle, Eisenhower was ready to surrender. Lyndon B. Johnson died of a heart attack in 1973. He was alone at his Texas ranch when he felt chest pains and called for help. His last words were, "Send Mike immediately." Mike was a Secret Service agent. The man who had escalated the Vietnam War died calling for protection that couldn't save him. Richard Nixon died in 1994 after suffering a stroke. He never regained consciousness, so he had no last words. The president, who had resigned in disgrace over Watergate, died in silence. Maybe that was fitting for a man who had spent so much of his career keeping secrets. Ronald Reagan died in 2004 after a long battle with Alzheimer's disease. He hadn't been able to speak for years before his death. His last coherent words, spoken years earlier, were to his wife Nancy, "I love you." The great communicator's final message was the simplest and most important one of all. Some presidents died so long ago that we don't know their exact last words. George Washington died in 1799 after catching pneumonia. The doctors tried to cure him by bleeding him, which probably made everything worse. His last clear words were spoken to his secretary. "I am just going. Have me decently buried, and do not let my body be put into the vault in less than 3 days after I am dead." He was worried about being buried alive, which was a real fear back then. John Quincy Adams collapsed on the floor of the House of Representatives in 1848. He'd returned to Congress after his presidency and was still fighting for his beliefs at age 80. His last words were, "This is the last of Earth. I am content." He died 2 days later, having served his country until the very end. Martin Van Buren died in 1862, long enough to see the Civil War begin. His last words were, "There is but one reliance." He was probably talking about relying on God, but we're not completely sure. Van Buren had lived through the birth of American politics, and he died watching the country tear itself apart. William Henry Harrison holds the record for shortest presidency. He died just 31 days after taking office. He caught pneumonia after giving a long inaugural speech in cold, wet weather without a coat. His last words were, "Sir, I wish you to understand the true principles of the government. I wish them carried out. I ask nothing more." He was talking to his vice president, John Tyler, trying to pass on his vision for America. John Tyler lived until 1862, dying just as the Civil War was starting. He'd actually been elected to the Confederate Congress, making him the only president to side with the rebellion. His last words were, "Perhaps it is best." Maybe he realized that his political choices had been wrong, or maybe he was just ready to go. Some presidents died in ways nobody saw coming. Chester A. Arthur kept his kidney disease secret from the public. He died in 1886, and his last words were, "Life is not worth living." Arthur had become president after Garfield's assassination, and the weight of unexpected leadership had crushed him. Grover Cleveland died of a heart attack in 1908. He was the only president to serve non-consecutive terms, and his last words were, "I have tried so hard to do right." Cleveland had always been known for his honesty, and even on his deathbed, he was worried about whether he'd done the right thing. William Howard Taft died in 1930. He'd been happier as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court than he'd ever been as president. His last words were, "If this is dying, I am not afraid to die." The big, jovial man, who had never really wanted to be president, faced death with courage. Woodrow Wilson died in 1924, broken by his failed fight to get America to join the League of Nations. He'd suffered a massive stroke while campaigning for his peace plan and never fully recovered. His last words were, "I am ready." Wilson had spent his last years trying to prevent another world war. Knowing that he'd failed, looking at all these final moments, what do we learn about the men who led America? First, that power doesn't make you immortal. These were the most important people in the world during their time, but death came for them just like it comes for everyone else. Second, their last words usually weren't about politics or policy. They talked about their families, their pain, their fears, their faith. Abraham Lincoln worried about what people thought of his wife. James K. Polk told Sarah he loved her. Ronald Reagan's last coherent words were, "I love you," to Nancy. Third, many of them died far from Washington, far from the power and prestige of the presidency. Jefferson died at his beloved Monticello. Adams died in his family home in Massachusetts. Roosevelt died at his retreat in Georgia. In the end, they went home. Fourth, a lot of presidential deaths were caused by the medical limitations of their time. Garfield and McKinley died from infections that modern antibiotics could have cured. Washington died from treatments that made him worse, not better. If these men had lived in our era, many of them would have survived. But here's what's most striking. Almost all of them faced death with dignity. Even when they were scared or in pain, they tried to be considerate of others. McKinley told people not to hurt his assassin. Lincoln worried about his wife's feelings. Theodore Roosevelt politely asked for the lights to be turned off. As of today, we still have 5 living former presidents: Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Joe Biden, and Donald Trump. Carter is the oldest at 99, and he's been in hospice care. When his time comes, what will his last words be? Will Clinton talk about policy or his family? Will Obama quote Lincoln or speak from his heart? We don't know, and maybe that's okay. Death is the one thing that remains private in our age of social media and constant coverage. When these men die, their families will probably be the only ones who hear their final words. And that's as it should be. You might wonder why we should care about how presidents died. After all, isn't how they lived more important than how they died? But I think these final moments tell us something crucial about leadership and humanity. These men made decisions that affected millions of people. They commanded armies, signed laws, shaped the future. But when death came calling, they were just people, worried about their families, afraid of pain, hoping for peace. That's not diminishing their achievements. If anything, it makes their accomplishments more impressive. They were human beings with human fears and weaknesses, just like us. Yet they rose to meet the challenges of their time and left the world different than they found it. Their last words remind us that greatness doesn't mean being superhuman. It means being fully human while carrying impossible responsibilities. It means caring about your country while also caring about your wife, your children, your friends. Death, as they say, is the great equalizer. It doesn't matter if you're a farmer from Illinois or a general from Texas. It doesn't matter if you went to Harvard or if you barely had any formal education. When your time comes, you face the same mystery that every human being has faced since the beginning of time. The presidents knew this. That's probably why so many of them spoke about faith in their final moments. Not necessarily organized religion, but faith in something bigger than themselves. Faith that their work mattered. Faith that they'd see their loved ones again. Faith that America would continue long after they were gone. And they were right about that last part. The republic they served has outlasted all of them. It survived civil war, world wars, depressions, scandals, and every other crisis you can imagine. The presidency continues because the idea behind it is bigger than any one person. What can we learn from these presidential death scenes? First, tell the people you love that you love them. Polk's last words to Sarah, Reagan's "I love you" to Nancy, Adams thinking about Jefferson. Love is what lasts. Second, don't take yourself too seriously. Fillmore commenting on his soup, Tyler saying, "Perhaps it is best," even Washington giving detailed burial instructions. They stayed human even at the end. Third, finish your work while you can. Grant racing to complete his memoirs, Wilson still fighting for peace, John Quincy Adams collapsing in Congress. They served until they couldn't serve anymore. Fourth, face whatever comes with courage. Eisenhower asking God to take him, McKinley singing hymns, Harrison trying to pass on his principles. They didn't go quietly into that good night, but they went with dignity. The story of American presidents doesn't end with death. Their words and actions echo through history, influencing leaders who came after them. Lincoln's vision of a house that cannot stand divided still guides us. Roosevelt's New Deal still shapes our understanding of government's role. Kennedy's call to ask what you can do for your country still inspires young people. Their last words are just the final chapter in stories that continue to be written. Every time we vote, every time we stand for the national anthem, every time we debate what America should be, we're continuing the conversation these men started. And someday, historians will write about the presidents of our era the same way we've talked about Washington and Lincoln and Roosevelt today. They'll analyze their decisions, debate their legacies, and yes, record their final words. Because that's what we do as Americans. We remember our leaders, we learn from their successes and failures, and we try to do better. The presidency is bigger than any one person, but it's made up of individual human beings who did their best with the time they were given. Their last words remind us that even the most powerful people are mortal, but their examples remind us that mortality doesn't diminish the impact we can have on the world. We're all going to die someday. The question is, what will we do with the time we have? The presidents we've talked about today answered that question by dedicating their lives to public service. They weren't perfect, far from it, but they tried to leave America better than they found it. And in the end, isn't that all any of us can do? So the next time you complain about politics, or wonder if your vote matters, or think about giving up on the American experiment, remember these men. Remember that they were human beings just like you, facing impossible choices and doing their best. Remember their last words, their final moments of humanity. And then ask yourself, what legacy do you want to leave behind? What will your last words reveal about who you really were? Because in the end, we're all just people trying to make our way in the world. Some of us happen to be presidents, but we're all in this together, and we all face the same final mystery. That's what makes us human. That's what makes their stories our stories. And that's why their last words still matter today.